So I think we'll begin now. This webinar is originating from the City of Vancouver, which is founded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Hello, my name is Sophie King. I am the Professional Learning and Events Coordinator for PIBC. Welcome to our timely webinar on coping strategies, health and well-being for professional planners. This webinar was developed in response to concerns raised by PIBC members regarding an increasingly stressful and negative work environment. It is all about practical workplace strategies aimed at making you more resilient as a professional planner. And now I am pleased to introduce our panel. First off, we have Laura Tate, who is an urban planning researcher and practitioner with Laura Tate Associates. And then from Argyle, we have presenting Jane Newlands and Kim Blanchette. Jane is the Senior Vice President of Engagement, and Kim is the Senior Vice President and General Manager. I'm just clicking a few more people in. Okay. And finally, we have Lynda Monk, Founder and Director of Thrive Training and Coaching. We have a few more people entering the room. I want to encourage everybody to type in their questions in the chat window located to your lower left-hand corner of your screen. If it's a question that requires 1 or 2 or 3 word answers very quickly for clarification, our speakers will answer them as they go along. Otherwise, we will hold off on answering other questions until the end of the presentation. So now I will ask Laura to please turn on your webcam and your mic to begin your presentation. Laura will begin the webinar by examining the science behind effectively working with elected officials and other decision makers. So I will get off the screen, and Laura, if you could start your webcam and your mic.
Okay, can you see me and hear me now?
Could you share your webcam with us? Share your image. There you go.
That's always the thing that I forget.
Yeah, that's okay. Good.
Okay. Ready?
I'll just move your presentation along and you.
Wonderful. Okay. Thanks, everybody. I know that your time is very valuable, so I will try to give you something that is helpful and done quickly so that you can hear the other presenters and their wonderful information. I want to give you a little bit of context. A lot of this presentation comes from some material that I've been researching for a book, but my whole motive in doing this research was because when I was a practitioner, especially when I was a more junior practitioner, but even up until just a few years ago, I found sometimes it would be very frustrating when I'd have some information that my decision makers didn't necessarily hear. And we all appreciate that our decision makers have a lot of context that we don't necessarily have. So my issue was not that I disagreed with their decision, but it was that I felt they made the decision without understanding. So I think because a lot of us have that role of giving advice in our jobs, it's really important for us to feel as effective as possible. So today what I want to do is help you unpack a little bit some of the things that can get in the way of giving your message effectively, and also help give you, I guess, just sort of the basics of a toolkit to respond. And this is really just a launching point. It's not enough detail for you to be instantly, 100% better than before. So anyway, I just wanted to recognize that decision-making is a hard thing to do. Our elected officials often come to us without backgrounds in planning or engineering. They come to us with a lot of passion, with a lot of community experience. And so really our job is to support them. Even though some days it may feel a bit hostile, I think if we can always remember that our job is to support them as the elected representatives, it can make things a lot more helpful. So I wanted to start, first of all, by talking about barriers. Because of the length of this webinar, I'm only going to look at a couple of them. And, oh, pardon me, I'll go back there. I had an animation in the non-webinar version. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about something called cognitive busyness and stress and incivility. So if you understand the barriers, it's a lot easier to start thinking about how to respond. So let's look at cognitive busyness. This is a concept that actually comes from cognitive psychology as well as from learning. In fact, as early as the 1970s, educational experts were recognizing that if people's brains were full, essentially they had a lot that they were preoccupied by, learning was that much more challenging. And if you think about our decision makers right now, our elected officials, especially if they are coming into the job without a background in planning or engineering or parks, they're learning really quickly. They're absorbing a lot of information, and they have to make decisions very quickly as well and keep a lot of interest groups happy. So they have a lot of competing demands just from the new subject matter or from the community demands that change. On top of that, they are actually, unless they are serving the city of Vancouver, perhaps the city of Victoria, many of them have day jobs. And you have no idea what their day jobs can be like and how much energy that can take. So those are all things that contribute to that state of cognitive busyness that can help make it frustrating for them and for you. So essentially, this is where the multiple responsibilities and heavy deadlines get in the way. I want to talk a little bit more about the issue of stress and incivility, which I understand from Sophie is part of the reason that people were really interested in having a webinar like this. So we all assume that our elected officials are probably extroverts, or if not extroverts, people who are very comfortable being in the public realm. That may be the case, but they're also in a political context where they have people who would have liked to have had their jobs. Again, this sounds obvious, but I think it's easy to overlook sometimes just how much stress that can create for a decision maker. They took a risk to get elected, and now they have people looking over their shoulder with every decision they're making. So especially in local government, as we all know, public hearings can bring out people who may have really useful things to say, but they can also be quite critical. So this is again significant from a learning perspective. Through my research, I discovered just how much what's going on in your body as a stress response also inhibits the learning ability. So when people are uncomfortable or under stress, their bodies produce more cortisol. And there have been some studies over time, several studies that show that more cortisol actually physiologically impairs some of the learning process. And it can even damage the brain if you are under stress over a prolonged period of time. It's not to say it can't be repaired, but it just shows how toxic that negativity can be, not just for us, but for our elected officials. So I won't go through some of the other issues, but I want to talk a little bit more now about how we can respond to some of these. So what do we do? Well, there are a number of different items that I think could be helpful to us, and I'll go through these in a little bit more detail now. So the first of these, I call it planning for cognitive busyness. So rather than wishing that people weren't so busy, wishing they would just read more carefully, we have to recognize that they're busy. And what this also means is that we have to help them manage the stress of that. So sometimes, a council meeting can be pretty stressful. None of us have control over that. But if we do have an opportunity, or our supervisor has an opportunity to have a lower profile discussion, sometimes even a committee of the whole meeting can be a lower profile discussion, that can really reduce the stakes a little bit. It can make things a little less stressful. The other thing I would really encourage you to do is always start with the bottom line. Here's the decision I need. Here's the implication of my research. Now I'm going to give you the details. Because if you have a lot of technical information that you're throwing at your decision maker and they're stressed, they're kind of panicking. You may not see it on their faces, but inside they're panicking. So the more you can just say, here's the bottom line, here's your decision, and now I can walk you through how we got there. That's a little thing that it can help a lot. Most of you probably already know that PowerPoint slides with a lot of text can also overwhelm people. And if you do have to use text, I've been given the advice that I think is very sound, which is no more than 5 to 7 words per bullet, no more than 3 bullets per slide. So there are a few other techniques that we don't have time for, but I'm sure as soon as you start putting your mind to this, you'll be able to do a bit of brainstorming on your own for your specific decision maker. The other concept is a little different, and it comes to us from adult education. It's called scaffolding, so just like the image here. And scaffolding is a concept that educators use a lot when they talk about children, and they mean it quite literally in this sense, where an adult instructor will, basically do a piece of the task that the child can't do, and then the child starts to become comfortable with small steps. Now, we're not going to be doing this kind of thing for our grown-up decision makers who have reputations and images to protect, but what we can do is structure things so adults can draw more on their own existing resources. So we'll talk a little bit more about this. And I guess a fundamental concept for us to remember is that it all starts with our brains and with the neural networks that we use in the learning process. So this image is very telling because it shows us how connections are a big part of how we think. And with adults, when they learn something new, because our brains use so much energy, they proportionately use more energy than our bodies do, it's more efficient for the brain to build onto an existing network. So when I talk to engineers about this, I often say, well, just like infrastructure, you always want to tap onto the existing infrastructure wherever you can. You don't want to build new facilities that you don't have to build. And the brain works in the same way. So the more that when you're presenting, you can help a decision maker anchor the new information onto some existing channel in their brain, the easier and the less stressful it will be for your decision maker. There's a saying in psychology called neurons that wire together, fire together. And what that means is the more you've got something linked in to an existing piece of the neural network, then when you're starting to kind of stimulate or get input that kind of uses that piece, then everything comes into focus and it can be quite powerful. An example I'll give you of that is around language learning. I guess we don't have a polling system, but probably most of you have at least learned high school French or a smattering of that. If you've then traveled to Mexico and wanted to pick up a bit of Spanish, you might have found that all of a sudden Spanish seemed easier than learning French was. I know that I had that issue myself, or that experience. So concepts that might be difficult at first, like the fact that there is a gender to a noun in French, le, la, les, all of a sudden when you're learning Spanish, you don't have to learn that concept from scratch. So it's plugged into an existing set of ideas. So how can we do this? I mean, we aren't intimately involved with our decision makers on a daily basis in most cases. But we can think about some basics as human beings that we might all have in common. So things like, what does a person's day look like? Most of us have an alarm clock that gets us up in the morning. Most of us have to prepare meals. We have basic survival skills. We have families, whether or not we have children. We've had parents, cousins. We were once children. We follow the news. In a city, we all have common reference points. So the more you can make a comparison between an idea that you're trying to get across and some of those common reference points, the more you're going to help people tap into that existing neural network of theirs. So there are several different types of scaffolding that are worth learning about, and because of time constraints, I'm just going to speak to one, which is the emotional scaffolding piece. Now, when I first read this term, I thought, oh goodness, they can't be expecting me to become a therapist for my decision maker. And that's not at all the case. It's again about making things more comfortable. So people aren't stressed, so you're not triggering that cortisol response. So a couple of different ways of doing that. One relates to the cognitive busyness piece, and that's about trying to lower the emotional stakes. But also it's about helping people see that they've had successes in the past. And I can't stress that enough, because your decision makers are in a tough situation and they really do need to be reminded that they have done good work. So the more you can say, just as when we faced this challenge and, council, you advised us to do X, Y, and Z, in this case, I think it's a very similar decision. So that can be very, very helpful. The other piece of this that we're going to talk about in just a minute is giving a better evidence base. If your elected officials are stressed and they are having to justify challenging decisions to their electorate, make sure that they are well armed and they feel confident that the decision really is the best decision and that you've given them a solid evidence base that they can understand. And then also, the more you can manage your own stress, I think the more you will create that sense that, everything's okay, we've got a process, we can work through this. You'll send that message that, that they should feel okay as well. There's a concept of emotional contagion we sometimes hear about, and if one person is stressed or negative or hostile, it can often transfer to other folks. And so we want to kind of do that in reverse. We want to hope that a positive mood can also be contagious. I should maybe pause here and just see if there are any areas that are really unclear at this point in time. I know we can't do this in an interactive way, but do let me know in the chat box if there's anything that's not making sense or a quick question. No? Okay. We'll keep going then. So I do want to talk now about this evidence base because I think that's a really important piece. What you see here is an image of a whole bunch of people. I think often when we use statistics in planning and in any kind of policy making, we love to give averages. What's the average household size? What is the percentage of people in low income, but it doesn't really go beyond that. What is the percentage of people who are seniors? And then we often tend to use those statistics in a way that imply that all seniors are alike. But in fact, all seniors are not alike. What we have seen is that, in fact, some seniors are well, some seniors are frail and fragile. And there's a very big difference between seniors at kind of the older end of that age range and the younger end. My point here is that the more that you can provide evidence that breaks down the population and shows the distinct characteristics and need sets, the more confident your decision makers and your public will be that you have understood the community. So beyond good planning, why does this matter? I think we've all experienced something called the rise of populism, which is where you have there are two things that go with that politically. First of all, you have a growing distrust of elite groups, and you also have a sense that nobody's paying attention to me, that my needs have been overlooked. As a planner, you are definitely, and any kind of professional, you are definitely going to be more suspect in a case where populism is on the rise. And so the more that you can do to show that you actually are recognizing the different need sets that people have and that you don't want to overlook a group. You're not going to change things overnight, but you can start to reduce some of the tension that can come when people are feeling hard done by and ignored and overlooked, and when they have elected people who are anti-professional or anti-elite. So there's some other things that we can do, though, in relation to evidence. So, beyond just giving more details on how different groups might experience some of the policies that we're implementing, I think we also, as planners, need to get our house in order a little bit more about using the right evidence to answer the right question. What I wanted to, sorry, I'm just looking, somebody here has had a question saying, for some people, the issue is more disinterest in the topic and would love to have more of an idea on how to engage with those decision makers. Maybe I'll just answer that question really quickly to say that I think it's important to find a way to show how what you're talking about will affect the decision, what the decision maker cares about. Now, sometimes that means doing a little bit of sleuthing. Sometimes it means, having an extra conversation with someone who knows the decision maker well. And sometimes what it can mean is even, this will sound funny, but I have made it a practice of watching council meetings and trying to get a sense of what things come up. You only have so many hours in a day, but even if you can fast forward through some of the slow discussions and just get a sense of what people are interested in, what they care about, if this person's always concerned about traffic safety, then how can you relate the issue you're dealing with the traffic safety issues the person's passionate about? Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. So just to return to evidence, and I'm almost done with my presentation, I mentioned the importance of using the right kind of evidence to answer a particular question. One of the things I've seen in both my professional practice and even in some academic practice is a temptation to always use statistics, even when they're not really answering our question very effectively, and a belief that quantitative information is somehow more reliable and better suited to answer questions. If you're wanting to know how many children there are so that you can deal with school capacity issues, then sure, statistics are a great thing. But if you're wanting to know about people's satisfaction with their housing choices or the housing choices available to them in your community, then obviously you're going to need more qualitative information. And unfortunately, a lot of our cities are doing lots of great reports using tons of metrics, and they're assuming that progress in a particular metric is a sign that all is well. And I can't think of a worse metric than number of permits processed per month. I bet you a lot of you have looked at that statistic and said, yeah, but that doesn't reflect the difference between a single family home that's built according to the regulations versus, you know, a high-rise tower in a neighborhood that's never experienced it. You know, or even the time taken for a permit. There's a wonderful book I would encourage all of you to get. It's actually really well written, easy to read, and it's called The Tyranny of Metrics. And it's written by an economic historian who talks about all the terrible uses of metrics that we see. So the key piece I want to sort of leave you with on that is that if you can avoid perpetuating that, I think you'll start to build trust. And I do have some ideas if people want to follow up with me later on how you can do qualitative research in a way that doesn't have to cost a lot of money or use a lot of staff time. So to conclude, let's see if we can get this to go here. To conclude, I think it's really important for you to get a sense not just of the general obstacles your decision makers are facing, but some of the specific ones that are very particular to where you're working and the people you're serving. So understand what those obstacles are, and then think a little bit more about what you can do in particular to help people face and address some of those challenges. I would love to hear from you, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to follow up, and if there's anything I can do to help, I'd be happy to discuss that offline. So thank you again, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other presenters.
Thank you, Laura. You have given us a lot to think about. That was great. And now I will ask Jane and Kim to turn on their webcams and mics to start their presentations. Jane and Kim will explore strategies and tips for managing conflict when working with an angry public. And we do have some questions which we will address at the end.
Perfect.
Thank you.
I will advance the slides.
Could you turn on?
Hi, I'm Jane.
Could you turn on your webcam, Jane?
Oh.
You need to start sharing. There you go. Thank you.
I turned it on, but I didn't start sharing was my problem.
Yeah, that's great.
Hi, I'm Jane, the Senior Vice President of Public Engagement with Argyle. You might be more familiar with us as Context Research. Last year, we joined the Argyle Group, becoming part of one of the largest independent strategic communications and engagement firms. I've got 25 years in public engagement and have had extensive experience in conflict, from mayors tying themselves to trees in front of bulldozers to local residents dealing with losses due to flooding. Today, my colleague Kim and I will share some of our experiences and tips for managing conflict and emotion. My focus will be on pre-planning and what you can do in advance of the meetings to prepare to deal with the conflict, and how you prepare and design an event can have a significant impact on the outcome. Despite the best planning, though, we do know that conflict can still occur, and Kim will share her tips and tricks for managing conflict in the moment. So the first sort of concept that I want to talk about is the need to avoid the us and them. Understanding where anger comes from and the perceived power imbalance is often what leads to conflict. People get angry when they're frustrated, when they feel that they're not heard, or when they feel they don't have any control over the outcome. Recognizing this up front and planning the event and addressing these in an empathetic way is a good way to de-escalate. For example, if you know that there is a feeling of powerlessness among the community or a big imbalance between the community and the decision makers, so what venue select can have an impact on that. Look for a place where you can go to them, where you can go to a place where they feel safe and comfortable. Also choosing the right style of event. So depending on what you want to accomplish and how heated you think the discussion is, the actual type of event that you choose can have a significant impact on that. Generally, we don't recommend town halls because that actually is the perfect example of an us versus them, with us at the front of the room and them at the back, or vice versa, depending on which crowd you're in. Other options include workshops, open houses, design charrettes where you're co-creating something. That's a really good way to rebalance the power effect. We do recognize that sometimes you are in a formal hearing process and then your room setup is kind of poised against you with the us versus them, but to the extent that you have control over what kind of event to choose, definitely think about how the audience will feel most comfortable for the discussion. The next one, which builds on that, which is about creating a sense of we. Again, it's about avoiding us and them, but creating us together as we and how to problem solve together. So even simple things about the way you dress can set up an us and them or a we. So I often get the question from clients, well, how do I dress for this event? And I also say, well, what do we think our audience will be wearing? You don't want to be showing up in a three-piece suit while everyone else is in t-shirts and jeans. On the other hand, you don't want to be in a t-shirt and jeans when everyone else is in a three-piece suit. So the idea is to make sure that you're blending in and creating that perception of an even playing field, even by the way that you're dressed. Providing an opportunity to engage informally at the beginning of an event is also a good way to create a sense of connection and start getting the idea of a we. And then finally, really focusing on highlighting what we have in common to create a sense of connection and trust before diving into contentious issues. So when you're at a meeting, whatever the topic is obviously important to both of you. So there's an immediate place of connection in terms of you already have a shared value that the topic of which you're talking about is important. The next is to think about setting the stage, and this goes back a little bit to the type of event and room setup, but how you create that is important, because when you have a presenter at the front of the room and everybody in chairs, again, you've created an us and a them. Whereas if you create a more circular opportunity or do small groups where people can interact, that creates a more sense of a we and a common purpose. And then again, how your team intersperses with the audience. So if you're in the circle in the bottom picture here, if you're all sitting on one end, again, you've created a sense of everyone else and us. Whereas if your team is interspersed between the group, then you've created more of a sense of we're all in this together. The other thing we really recommend is to be prepared. When preparing for what you believe it will be in a contentious engagement, there are several things that you can do. One of the things that we really value is using some pre-engagement interviews. And this is really important, particularly if you know it's very contentious. And what we would suggest is going out and meeting with some key stakeholders or individuals or small groups in advance to have a conversation, understand their concerns and what they're looking for. This is a couple of things. One, that actually early engagement and listening can actually calm a sense of anger so people don't come to the meeting as angry. It also can help to build trust that you're sincere in terms of the need to listen and do something differently going forward and to build rapport. And finally, it also gives you valuable insights into what you might be facing at the event, which you can use in your pre-planning. We also develop very comprehensive event plans and facilitation guides, as well as do pre-event training. So in this, we do things like assigning key roles, but also floaters. And the responsibility of the floater is to watch how everyone else is doing and perhaps interject themselves into the conversation as needed. We also often identify a signal like touching your shoulder, just to signal to your colleagues that you might be in a tough conversation, and bringing a third person into that conversation would be helpful. Also having a senior decision maker who has been empowered to either pull the plug, or if you can have another room outside the room, a safe space where someone can actually have the opportunity to sit down one-on-one with the senior decision maker. That empowers them and gets them heard, but then also allows the group to continue with its work. Also in the pre-engagement, we do some role playing, and we also teach people to ask probing questions, because often when confronted with anger, people get defensive and they start to defend their position, which just escalates the situation. Whereas the alternative approach would be to probe and try to understand why that person is feeling that way. So what is it about this that makes you feel that way? How would you see this playing out in a way that would work better for you? So asking probing questions and seeking to understand their point of view will help also de-escalate. We also think through potential scenarios and role play how the team would handle them. So for example, someone is angry and continues to escalate. What we might do is write down their comment and then seek feedback on whether you've captured it correctly. Why would this help? Well, it interrupts the tirade and gets them focused on working with you to make sure the information is captured correctly. Another one might be somebody's becoming increasingly frustrated and assuming you don't understand or you don't care. Sometimes if you have collateral around the room, like a map or a diagram or pictures of the plans, being able to walk somebody over and have them point out pieces. One, the movement just creates some energy that helps break the flow, which can help decrease stress levels. And then also, again, with the probing questions, you can really seek to understand what they're trying to say, and then they will feel more heard. So now I'm going to pass it over to Kim to say, well, even with the best planning and all the prep, it's the night of the event and people are angry.
Thanks, Jane. I'm like wheeling chairs here. Well, thanks. My name's Blanchette. I, as was introduced, the Senior Vice President and General Manager for Argyle, Western Canada. Very new to the agency world. I spent 26 years in communications and engagement for provincial and federal government departments across Canada. So I have been really on that front line and then having to go back and explain to my decision makers what happened. But as Jane said, despite all the planning and the scenarios you have in place, sometimes you just end up with a really angry crowd. And back in the late 90s, I was a very junior communications professional, and I was handed what I thought was a great assignment. It was communications and engagement for a co-located forensic psychiatric center and maximum security prison in a very densely populated part of Halifax, Nova Scotia. I was asked, my first day on the job, I was told there was a public meeting that night, and it was at a community center, and could I pick up donuts on the way to the meeting? There was nothing to worry about. It was going to be great. Maybe 10 or 12 people would show up. We showed up. We got a debrief in the kitchen, and I was told I would go out and I would be the moderator. I would introduce the subject matter experts to the 10 or 20 people, and then we would engage in some questions. So we go out. There were 350 people in the room. As we approached the podium, they all stood up. They all started screaming at once. As I was trying to make my feeble attempts to manage the crowd, I turned to get some guidance from the director of the program, only to realize all of the subject matter experts made a hasty retreat back to the kitchen, leaving me standing alone with the angry people. It took about 45 minutes to get people calm down enough to even have the presentations, and I remember seeing the media coverage that night, and the opening line was, "They devoured those government officials like a pack of angry wolves." That set the tone for the engagement of this project, and I learned an awful lot in a few very short months. But I think what some of the things I learned in terms of how to get out of it in the moment, how to kind of get it back on track. And Jane, I'll be repeating some of the points that Jane's made, but it seems crazy to tell a bunch of professionals to listen, but it's often in the way you listen. And I'll recommend a book as well. James McNamara, who is a communications engagement researcher out of Australia, has written a book called Organizational Listening. You don't have to buy the book, because he's also published a really good 64-page synopsis of the book, which tells you everything you need to know. But he studied the UK government's communications and engagement activities for a couple of years, and determined that 90% of the listening that organizations were doing was only to prepare to speak. And this was reflected in the relationships they were having and in the engagement and communications results they were having with the residents of the United Kingdom. And so he established this architecture of listening, which really brings us back to that premise of two-way conversation, of really listening to understand and be able to reflect what you're hearing back. So in some cases, it's really just listening, and just trying to listen without defensiveness, trying to listen without an agenda. Sometimes that means, as Jane said, kind of moving off or having a private conversation to let that person get vent. Often this is the first time that person really feels that they've been in front of somebody that in their mind has power to make a decision, or in their mind is actually going to take that information back. You know, letting people know that that feedback's important. You really want to get it all down, asking those probing questions, as Jane put out, really getting to that point where you can have a fruitful conversation. Another effective strategy I found is using your floaters, but also having a front-end reception and having people working the reception desk that can flag early on the people that you know are going to have issues or raise issues or be angry. Often they can read the body language, and I've had the opportunity to go and introduce myself before the meeting starts and have a bit of a chat with somebody, and that really dissipates, that attention can often dissipate an angry response. Obviously, offering to meet further with that angry participant, especially if they're really derailing the conversation, can be helpful, but it can backfire if they feel they're being shut down. So really asking, engaging the crowd, and I'll talk about leveraging the crowd, asking others if they feel the same way, or if they do want to explore a specific target, kind of bring others into the discussion. There are times, though, as Jane said, if you have a decision, you really do have to rein it in. Obviously, offensive, dangerous behavior can't be tolerated. And making people understand that there needs to be a respectful dialogue. And that brings us really to building those ground rules. You know, as somebody that's participated in engagement activities, one of the things I find really that gets my back up is walking in and seeing a posted list of rules that's been provided to me like I'm a school child. And so for me, I think it's always been really effective to just take a few minutes to establish those ground rules together. You know, giving the power of the session to the participants. This is your session. We're here to get the most out of your feedback. How do you want to proceed? What do you feel are the rules? So how can we make sure everybody has equal opportunity to speak? How should we manage emotional subjects or controversial subjects? What are we going to do when we get off topic? How long are we going to let that go before we rein it in? And how will we treat each other with respect? And establishing that up front really kind of helps you limit the reaction when they occur. Another thing is often, you know, agreeing to, we're going to take a break if things get really heated, to allow people time to calm down and come back to the table. And that there'll be a process for recording the out-of-scope discussions. I saw a really interesting approach to that, where instead of calling it the parking lot, which often can mean this is something that's going to die, they've talked about an idea garden or you know, other opportunities to bring those pieces and those extra ideas into the conversation without being kind of relegated to something that people may feel just won't be heard. Once you've established the rules, really one of the best opportunities is to leverage the crowd. No one likes to see somebody else get yelled at, especially if they're just trying to do their job. So if you've listened with empathy, you've established those ground rules, often the crowd will police the behavior with some of the rowdier participants. You know, when one or two participants are dominating the conversation, acknowledging their points and then inviting the broader group to weigh in, asking if they want to continue on a certain topic or if they want to go to the next item in the agenda, really helps contain the conversation. And one of the really helpful tools I've noticed is to use the technology tools to bring more democracy to the meeting and allow some of the quieter participants, especially those that in the face of conflict are really going to shut down, have them contribute. So I really like some of the results I've had with using applications like Kahoot or Slido, and that's where you can use phones to vote on topics, to give feedback, to ask questions, to make comments, to comment on each other's feedback. I was at a session a few weeks ago where the questions were actually bumped to the top of the priority list by the likes and endorsements that the crowd was giving to those questions. So the top 5 questions were really getting voted on, and those were the ones that were brought into the discussion. And what I really liked about that was when I reviewed it afterwards, it was really the non-question questions that were getting voted down. People would acknowledge that somebody, was ranting a bit, but it was the meatier questions that were getting voted, but it wasn't the moderator, it wasn't the other people managing the engagement making that decision. It really was crowdsourced, and it was the technology that allowed people to say, yeah, that's a question I want answered, where they probably wouldn't do that if they were sitting next to somebody that was being really, really vocal. So I think that's a really, really helpful piece. I think this is probably the most important slide. These things happen. People are human. Meetings can erupt, and you could end with a session that's been hijacked by emotion, that doesn't get you the feedback you were looking for, that's stressed you out, that stressed out the decision makers. I think a good debrief and strategies for improvement are helpful, but I think ultimately it's really important to have a bit of self-kindness. This work is challenging, and you're often the only outlet that a frustrated participant has had access to. So some self-kindness, practicing your own calming strategies. I know for me, I tend to immediately feel it in my gut. So understanding when I'm about to react and just even taking that kind of moment and that purposeful deep breathing so that I can be fully present and help support somebody that may not be communicating in the most healthy of ways. So that's it for our part of the presentation, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Jane and Kim. You provided some great strategies when working with a not-so-happy public. Really good tips there. So now we will bring our attention to the individual planner, where we learn how to recognize and mitigate chronic mental stress with an emphasis on self-care. And here, Lynda will guide us through this portion of our webinar. Lynda, please turn on your webcam and your mic. There you go. And welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, and thanks to the previous speakers. I'm already learning so much. So I am a registered social worker and a certified life coach, and I've been working in the field of burnout prevention with professionals who work in very high stress and often high trauma work. And I've been doing this work for over 20 years, and that followed a 10-year career as a frontline social worker. So I'm going to take about 25 minutes to try to share what I hope will be extremely helpful to you in your high demanding work and the important work that you do as planners around the province. And I'm going to start by talking a bit about what is chronic stress, what is burnout. Stress is such a prevalent word in our society, in our workplaces. Everybody's stressed, everybody's busy. So what do we need to know about this to, in a meaningful way, actually manage stress so we can stay calm? You can stay in those regulated calm states to do the work you're doing, as some of the previous presenters have mentioned, is extremely important. And then we'll look at some prevention strategies and things you can do for your own self-care to reduce stress in the work that you do. So first of all, how big is the problem of chronic stress at work? There are all kinds of statistics kept on this by Health Canada, the World Health Organization, HRDC, and others. And this is just a snapshot from a magazine article I was recently reading, and it said that more than 6 in 10 highly stressed workers identify work as their main source of stress. So you can see here that other things are also sources of stress, but they are pale in comparison to the number of people who identify work as their main source of stress. So what that means is opportunities for addressing stress can happen in the workplace as well. There's a great link between stress and the onset of mental illness. This is just one statistic. There's many. But what this offers us is that employees who consider that most of their days to be extremely stressful were over 3 times more likely to suffer a major depressive episode in their lives. So the link between chronic high stress at work and mental illness, in this case depression, we also see stats like this around anxiety, addictions, and so forth. So we know that being able to manage stress isn't just good for our job performance, our engagement, it's really good for the total sum of our overall mental health and wellness in life and work. I want to introduce you to a model. This actually comes from my master's research back in 1998, but the model has stayed true and even been more fully supported out in the realms of organizational health work. And quite simply, it's the idea that, of course, there are many things we can do to manage our stress as individuals. Ultimately, our self-care is our responsibility. No one else will do that for us. But what's also true is the environment, the workplace itself, the nature of the work, the interactions in the work environment are the context in which you show up to do your work every day. And those factors equally play a role on what happens with stress management, what happens with employee well-being. So for example, you can have an individual who practices all kinds of stress management, self-care, is very proactive in managing their own stress, and put them in what might be called a toxic workplace where it's under-resourced, maybe not strong enough leadership, high conflict, and that individual who's doing lots to manage their own stress can still burn out and suffer. And likewise, you can take an individual who might not be doing very much at all for their stress management. They may not be engaging on purpose in a healthy lifestyle, and you can put them into a very robust environment, an organization that has good leadership, professional development, clear job descriptions, lots of peer support, and so forth, and it can actually carry that individual along. So what we know is, and by we I mean researchers, people who specialize in employee wellness, occupational health, and so forth, from a stress perspective, an employee well-being perspective, is that ideally we want to support individuals to manage stress, have strategies for doing that that are effective and relevant in terms of the work that you do, and we also want to create resilient work environments where stress management and employee well-being are core values, core priorities, and they're supported through healthy workplace practices. So what is job stress? We all hear about stress. Job stress, and in order to understand burnout, which is where I'll go next, is that stress we feel as a result of the unique experiences we have at work. And I know this slide has too many words on it, but I do have a couple of like that just to help with your note-taking and something you can reference beyond this time together. Burnout is the accumulation of occupational stress over time. So burnout doesn't just happen after a bad day or a rough week. We might collapse on the couch and say, oh, I'm so burnt out. But professional burnout is a very serious state to be in, both for our job performance and our overall health, and it's something that comes from being under chronic stress. So we all can carry that stress that ebbs and flows, that goes up and down in terms of its severity. But when we're seeping in it, when we're just in that high level of stress all the time, over time, and there's not that ebb and flow, we run the risk of job stress becoming burnout. What do we need to know about job stress? What are some of the factors that are predictive or very influential on our levels of stress at work? First of all, it's always a combination of both personal and job-related factors. So yes, we have professional boundaries. Our home life is our home life. Our work life is our work life. And we all know that if we are dealing with something in our personal lives that's very stressful, perhaps there's health issues, financial pressures, maybe relationship challenges, or going through a marital breakup, we're already carrying that stress load. It's already impacting us before we even start our day's work. And vice versa, what happens at work, if you've had a really stressful day at work, you come home with kind of what's left over, and that might be feelings of exhaustion or depletion. And so we know that stress at work and stress at home, while they're distinct domains in our lives, they intricately influence one another. Workload. If workload is manageable, you feel like you can do the work you're tasked with doing, then obviously job stress will be lower. If you perpetually feel that the workload is extremely high, it's unmanageable, it's not something you really ever feel like you can accomplish, then job stress is higher. Again, this isn't just fluctuating day to day, but what's sort of the normative experience for you and your colleagues when you go to work. Autonomy and control. We've all heard the term being micromanaged. And the more autonomy we have, the more control we have to do our job in ways that are unique to us, that allow us to use our skills, our talents, and get the job done, the less job stress we have. So when there's less autonomy, typically people will report higher levels of job stress. Demands and resources ratio, quite simply, do you have the resources to do the job you're tasked with doing? Do you have the fiscal resources, the human resources, the intellectual resources, the training you need, the management support you need, and so forth? When you do, job stress is lower. When you don't, in various areas, then job stress can become much higher. The severity and frequency of stressors. We all experience stress, and not all stress is bad. We all need a certain amount of stress to motivate us to meet deadlines, to work well under pressure, and so forth. But chronic stress, the type that is wearing a person down over time, when they're having to hold a lot of stress perpetually, or situations that trigger a stress response, for example, working with the public, some of what's been mentioned in previous presentations, perhaps working with the public and they're very angry or upset, all those things, the more often you're in the face of those sorts of stressors, the higher your job stress is going to be. There are people who go to work every day and they never risk someone yelling at them as part of their work or being angry with them for what they're doing. My dad worked at Ford Motor Company for 35 years before he retired, and he never had to be an active listener or empathetic or sensitive to the needs of others. He simply had to stand in a paint booth, push a 4-digit code, and get the paint color right on the car. So not all occupations present us with the types of stressors that your work does or my work does, which really creates, by the nature of the work, that higher type of stress that can be part of the work. And lastly is work-family conflict. If, for example, your work and your work schedule really allows you to flow smoothly between the other parts of your life. So for example, if you have a child and they're in daycare and you have to pick them up at 4:30, do you naturally get off work at a time that makes that transition possible? If you're caring for aging parents, do you have the flexibility to be able to take them to medical appointments? And so forth. The more work-family conflict we experience, the higher our overall experience of occupational stress. So these are just some of the things that the research shows will be predictive and very influential on our own job stress experiences. So I just invite you to think about these in your own work and how the sort of inventory of things might look here for you. So what's burnout? Burnout is something that happens to hardworking, intelligent professionals who show up every day with an earnest desire to do the job that they're doing. And it is something that is, that's really important aspect of it, because it is that desire to make a difference, the desire to do a good job, that passion you have for what you do and so forth, that actually is a precursor to burnout. Without that, we don't risk burning out, but of course without that, we don't have a great chance of doing a good work with what we're doing either. So how do we know if we're suffering from burnout? How do we know if stress has become burnout? And where I'll go next is, what do we do about all of this? So burnout, the research shows, actually has 12 distinct stages of onset. And for our purposes, I've simplified it to 5 to kind of encapsulate the essence of it. But as I said, the first stage of burnout is that we're driven by an ideal. We're trying to do quality work. We have a desire to do a good job. The second stage is that while we're doing that, we're serving that purpose, we're serving that ideal, we start to have some subtle neglect of the self set in. So for example, maybe you used to take a lunch break and now you don't, you work through lunch. Maybe you used to meet up with some colleagues and go for a walk on an afternoon break, and now you spend that time texting or checking in on Facebook, and that self-care aspect isn't there. Whatever it might be, there starts to be a change in how you show up for your own needs. They start to become secondary or completely down on your to-do list. And that subtle deprivation over time creates what is stage 3, which is where you no longer see your own needs as valuable. Everything else is more important. Meeting the deadline, getting the job done, running the meeting, taking your dog to the vet. Everything is more important than your own needs for replenishment, rest, stress management. And over time, what happens with that self-neglect, there is a sense of exhaustion that can set in some cases depression. People can feel really apathetic, just don't really care much about what they're doing anymore, even about something they once really did care very much about. And over time, stage 5, or that full-blown experience of a professional burnout, we will hear it called hitting the wall, but it really is that physical, mental, and emotional collapse that can happen to a person. And I once had a woman say to me, we were talking about burnout, and she was saying she felt burnt out, and I asked her, well, how do you know you're burnt out? Why do you think you're suffering from burnout? And she looked at me and she said, well, because when I'm in the shower and I try to lather the shampoo, I can't even hold my arms up. They're just in agony. I am so exhausted. And you might think this is a woman who is on a stress leave and not at work. This woman is a high-performing professional. She travels all across British Columbia to do training work. And so the person is still doing what they do, but they're feeling like that, which is a very big burden and very taxing on one's health to carry that level of chronic stress that is turned to burnout and still try to function effectively, not just at work, but personally as well. So chronic stress and burnout symptoms present across all domains of our well-being, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and I'm not going to read all of these, but you can see that it's a combination of things. You might have tight muscles and a sore back, chronic headaches. You might have some digestive problems. There may be difficulty sleeping. You might have a hard time concentrating or making decisions, or feel more confused, or feel overwhelmed more easily. Emotionally, you might feel frustrated and impatient, and you might feel that way a lot of the time. You can even feel hopeless about what you're doing and about the future. And spiritually, there can be just this disconnect from a sense of meaning or purpose. And that can translate out into our relationships, where we might have more conflict, and that can happen both in our personal and our professional relationships. So, of course, all of these symptoms, they are the red flags. We want to know about these so we can be aware if we're experiencing them, so we can do something about it. So what can we do? Self-awareness is a stress management skill. Taking a regular inventory, pausing, and asking yourself, how are you doing? What is your current level of stress? How is stress manifesting in your personal life and in your work? That self-awareness and self-reflection helps you to be honest with yourself. It helps you to be on top of this so you can be responsive. So, for example, this is a simple method you can use. There's 2 I'll share with you. One is the green, yellow, and red light self-assessment. So green light is you're good to go. You are feeling energized, vibrant, engaged with what you're doing. There's some normal everyday stress, but you're certainly not feeling overwhelmed by it. You probably don't have a lot of those stress symptoms that I just noticed. And if you were to scale yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, being 10 really stressed, 1 not stressed at all, you'd be kind of in that 1, 2, 3 out of 10 zone, and you're really rolling along and doing quite well. The yellow light is when you're starting to get sort of some of those cautions. You're not feeling extremely stressed, but you're certainly sitting in that mid-range zone where it could kind of go either way depending on how you respond to it. You might be a 4, 5, 6 out of 10 in terms of if you were to rank yourself what stress level you're under right now. And the red zone is that full stop. You're feeling all kinds of stress symptoms, things I just shared on the previous slides. You may be feeling burnt out. You'll be feeling it emotionally and physically in different ways, and you just feel like this, where you just really feel like you're in that, if one more thing happens, the cup's going to tip over. It's just going to be too much to cope. You just feel on that. People will describe it as feeling on the edge and so forth. And that would be, 8, 9, 10 on that stress scale. So I invite you to think about this. Do you currently feel like you're in that green zone, yellow zone, or red zone? And without judgment and with self-compassion, self-kindness, just to notice. Because that noticing is of great value to you in terms of your own stress management. And to widen the net and think about people you work with, think about people in your life. Where are they sitting with this potentially? Because as someone already mentioned, there really is that contagion factor. If you show up at work and statistically there's 6 out of 10 people who are highly stressed, and you're one of the 4 who aren't or 3 that aren't, you have to be mindful that that surround will impact you, and vice versa. People who are in a less stressed state have the opportunity to help bring that self-regulated, calm presence out into the work environment to create that container of support and well-being for those around them who may be feeling a little more stressed. So I invite you to keep this in mind and use this as a self-check-in along the way. Some of this can feel very overwhelming to even think about. And awareness is prevention when it comes to managing stress, dealing with chronic stress that may exist, and certainly for burnout prevention. So thank you for listening and taking this in. I like this quote, "There's no need for alarm, only awareness. Keep in mind that it's not the load that breaks us down, it's the way we carry it." So I invite you to think about, how are you carrying your stress load? Are you carrying it lightly, gently? Are you fighting it? How's the load? What's the weight of it right now? So what's the difference? We can all feel stress overwhelm. We can all feel exhausted and worn down and tired on any given day, depending what we're dealing with. We can also move along a continuum where we feel very stress resilient, very happy and engaged in managing stress and so forth. So again, just to think about, where are you in this picture? So I'm going to just share some ideas about how to manage stress and things to keep in mind that can be helpful. The first is to take stress management seriously. Be proactive. The research clearly shows that people who have a more avoidant personality style, who just want to put their head in the sand and stress, what stress, and really not be proactive about creating strategies for dealing with it, will tend to suffer a bit more and succumb to higher stress. So being proactive, recognizing that stress is real, that it can affect us, and having plans for mitigating it in your day-to-day life as best you can. The other is to recognize that our self-care and stress management is unique. What might work for you might not work for somebody else. What's important is that you know what helps you manage stress, and you do those things. You take a regular inventory of the things you're doing as part of your health and well-being, and asking yourself what's working. So if you were to draw a picture of what your current self-care looks like, what would that picture be? Would it be filled with exercise, meditation, a healthy diet, connecting with friends? What might your current stress management picture look like? And if you don't know, that's a good place to start, is to just sit down and take an inventory of the things you do intentionally to help manage stress. It's important to remember that one size doesn't fit all, and that flows from what I just said, but we don't want to be judgmental of other people's ways of dealing with stress. And we also want to see it as a shared responsibility that people often need help to manage their stress. We don't need to be around additional criticism or people judging for how we might be doing with our stress, because that can just actually add to stress. So we want to create conversations that recognize that there are individual differences in terms of how stress impacts people, and there's individual differences in terms of how people might choose to deal with it. This is some work from the late Stephen Covey, and I'll just summarize this very quickly. He did some research and wanted to know what is in our realm of control. And his research showed that about 50% of what goes on in our daily lives as humans, we have no control over. About 35% we have some influence and control, and 15% we have control. So what does this mean for us with stress management? There are many stressors in our life that impact us greatly that we don't have any control over. The weather. If there was a snowstorm right now, it would impact all of us. But we can't control whether that happens or not. We can only control our response to it. There's lots of things around funding and decisions that get made, and we're living amidst times right now with so many uncertainties with the coronavirus and world politics and the environment. There are many big stressors that are in the news, in our lives, and that's just on the surface, that sit out in great measure in this area we might not have much control. So we might have some influence. So with the coronavirus, we can wash our hands regularly and practice everything we're being taught to do for prevention and so forth. When it comes to stress management, when we can put our energy, attention, our actions on those inner circles, the things that we can influence and control. So for example, if we're on a break with a colleague and we spend 15 minutes talking about things that are stressful to us that we have no control over, we're a lot more empowered and less stressed if we spend that 15 minutes talking about things we can influence, solutions we can embark on, and so forth. So to keep in mind, what is your sphere of influence and control? Optimism and staying positive, while it can seem maybe more challenging if we're feeling the effects of chronic stress, is actually a strategy for turning things around. The research in the field of resilience shows that having an optimistic and hopeful approach to the challenges and stressors in our lives helps us to weather them and actually thrive. And I love this Indigenous legend. Inside each of us is a battle of two wolves. One is filled with fear, jealousy, inferiority, and the other is filled with joy, peace, love, humility, and kindness. Which one wins? The one you feed. And the same is true as we manage our stress. If we ruminate a lot about our stress can actually get bigger. There's a saying that what we focus on grows. Whereas if we could put our attention into what are hopeful ways to deal with stress, what's possible, what's working, we help cultivate that energy and attention in that direction. I once had the privilege of hearing a First Nations physician speak at a wellness conference, and he held up his hand and asked us to imagine that he had a pie plate balanced. And he talked about the medicine wheel. And of course, this is a holistic model for our well-being. And when you think about your self-care, I invite you to think about how you tend to all domains of your well-being. How do you nourish your mental health, your mind? How do you foster positive thoughts and really replenish your thinking processes? Your spirit, that part of you that's your essence, your connection to what's meaningful to you, how are you taking care of that? Your body, how do you move your body, rest your body, feed your body, this vehicle that carries you through your daily life? And your emotions, all that's involved with giving and receiving care, being in relationship, connection. This is critically important for stress management because the research clearly shows that peer support and hence why things like team building and so forth are so important, actually is a predictor of burnout in a group of professionals who work together. The higher the peer support, the more positive the relationships. That is a mitigating or buffering factor to burnout. So it becomes important to our stress management. And back to the First Nations physician that I mentioned, he held his finger up and he had this, asked us to invite the picture of a pie plate. And he said, if there's any one of these domains that we are not tending to, the whole plate or our whole sense of well-being can actually be weakened. And so we want, someone might be very, tend to really well to their physical well-being. They go to the gym regularly and so forth. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll have everything they need for managing stress and staying healthy, because we want to balance and make sure we're tending to these other domains of our well-being as well. These are the bedrock, what's considered the essentials for our self-care, is getting a good night's rest, eating a healthy diet. We all know this, but it doesn't mean we all necessarily could do it consistently. Moving your body, exercising, and that social support with friends and family and coworkers. What we all know is that when we feel really stressed, this is more likely what our picture looks like. We're more likely having a hard time falling asleep or doing some Netflix binging, and we crave sugar and salts and so forth. And so we have to look at how, in the midst of our stress, what healthy choices are we making to ensure we're strong in mind, body, and so forth. Lastly, it's very important to rest your central nervous system. Stress fills us with adrenaline, cortisol, and other hormones that create that stress response. I'm sure you've all heard that fight, flight, or freeze response in the body. And your nervous system is being affected. The sympathetic nervous system is like the gas pedal, and the parasympathetic is like the brake. And we need to, and this picture is wonderful, do you feel mindful or mindful? And we can, again, this can shift at any given moment in the day, but to really consider, what do you do on purpose to regulate your central nervous system? When do you, some people engage in meditation and mindfulness practices, journaling. When do you just unplug from all the input, stimulation, technology, environmental stressors, noise stressors, and just let your system balance itself? The human system knows balance. Your body, your mind knows how to find a balanced state. It's just like a tree in nature. Given the right conditions, it knows how to thrive, and so do you, so do all of us. So really to ask, how are you giving your body a chance to do what it naturally knows how to do in terms of managing stress? These are considered the ABCs of self-care: awareness, being self-aware, balancing how you care for yourself, and ensuring that sense of connection. I know that we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm just going to end by mentioning a couple of things. I mentioned that this model of looking at individual self-care, how we care for ourselves, needs to interface with how the workplace creates conditions that allow for employee well-being and stress management. And this is the whole field of organizational health, workplace wellness. And it really is a shared responsibility, because without a shared responsibility, there's much more likeliness that we blame a victim. So if someone at work is very stressed, they might hear things like, well, if you can't handle the heat, get out of the kitchen. These aren't helpful messages for people to feel like they can care for themselves and reach out for support if they need it. So we need to have messaging in workplaces that show a commitment to mental wellness at work, to mental health at work. There's many things organizations can do, and this is just some of them, but having good, effective management and leadership is central to creating a healthy workplace environment. Good, strong communication, dealing with conflict as it comes up, supporting teamwork, peer support, really looking at how is that cultivated in your team, in your working group. Having regular acknowledgement, gratitude, praise, all that feel-good energy in the workplace. People are working hard, devoting so much of daily life to the jobs that you each do, and being acknowledged for it is a motivating factor. Really taking seriously respect at work and professional development, these are all resiliency strategies. Managing workload in a meaningful way, and having progressive work-life balance policies in place. And of course, understanding stress management and burnout prevention, not just at that individual level, but at the systemic and the organizational level as well. So I invite you to really keep in mind, what are you aiming for when it comes to your own mental wellness and managing stress and taking care of things if chronic stress is in your midst? To really have a good sense, how do you want to feel? What are the things that help you feel that way? How do you actively manage your stress in a proactive and responsive way? And to keep that question and the answers that flow really up front. So thank you for listening, and I welcome hearing from any of you. I can be reached at lindamunk.com. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Lynda. That was an enormous presentation. A lot to take in, and I promise I'm going to go back and review everything you've said because it's all very important. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your helpful tips and strategies that will help us all navigate through the difficult times. At this point, I invite the other speakers to turn on their webcams. And that's me. There's Laura coming on. Hi, Laura. And Jane and Kim. Thank you again. I enjoyed all the presentations. They were very insightful. We don't have a lot of questions, so maybe we'll answer the one question that we do have. This is from Lisa, and it's a question for Lynda. Can you speak? Oh, there's a big question. Okay. Lisa says, can you speak to the impact of the shared responsibility where racism and sexism show up in the workplace?
Yeah, thank you for your question. That really is around respect in the workplace and being very responsive to things related to any kind of harassment or bullying in the workplace. There are laws about how to handle that, and it's really important that when concerns are raised by staff, that they are taken seriously and responded to in a thoughtful and effective way. Because things like racism, sexism, sexual harassment in the workplace, of course, there's really a light on that right
great.
now.
Thank you,
and
Lynda.
here in Canada,
would anybody else like to comment on that question?
1 in 10 women have left a job because of sexual harassment in the workplace.
Oh, okay.
And I know men deal with this
so
as
we
well.
have
So dealing with these things effectively are staff retention strategies. They are also the legal and ethical responsibility
on
of
this
an
topic.
employer.
She provides some very good comments, and I guess to, in a nutshell, her question is, do you think that there needs to be more of a directive at the workplace or professional level, i.e. mandatory training, acknowledgement of the planner's emotional role within the codes of practice, more webinars like this? So I guess she's saying, are we doing enough in the workplace to help our planners do their job effectively and with self-care? Would anybody like to answer that on a higher level?
I'll jump in because I noticed the first part of the comments and the questions was around empathy. And I think what's really interesting is I one of the organizations I worked for previously was the Alberta Energy Regulator, and we actually launched a program around empathic engagement. And it really was about what does it mean to engage with empathy, and without recognizing the parameters around engaging, and especially when you're engaging in-house, and you can bring in to a specific engagement all of the tentacles from the last engagement, which may or may not have gone well, but the focus on empathy, not just for the participants, but for staff and creating that connection, for our team really led to less stress, less burnout, a bit more of a relationship focus, even when we were dealing with very fractious issues, things like, hydraulic fracturing, or things like landowners who were left hanging because businesses went under and there was nobody to clean up their land. And these were very, very contentious issues of safety and fairness. But the focus on empathy and the focus on understanding what that meant from both sides really, really helped. But it's required a lot of that kind of training. And I think we see that as well in any kind of Indigenous engagement. I'll leave that to Jane to speak about the role of empathy in Indigenous engagement communications.
Well, I mean, I think it's an issue in all of human interaction, really, and it's about showing curiosity and kindness. I think one of the most interesting programs, and I think it was actually BC Hydro who did it with their communities, but it's a Roots of Empathy program that they supported. And it really is about, at the very early age, teaching children to feel empathy for other children and more vulnerable children. And if you can come at it from that place of humanity and kindness and empathy, not only does it make the interaction better, you're going to learn more because people are actually going to open up. Because often when you have an engagement, often the issue that people are yelling about first isn't their core issue. You have to really explore with them, and they may be coming from that fear or that loss of control, and really understanding where they have control and what they have influence over can help them feel better. So I think empathy is an important part of any human interaction, whether it be in the workplace or in engagement or communications.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And if I could jump in for, yeah, oh, absolutely. And it's interesting how we're all tackling this question from different angles, because I think empathy has a place in so many different aspects of the work that we do. I'll just maybe add another dimension to that, because I think what you've all been saying about this is so important. When I was speaking earlier about really trying to understand the public that we serve and the decision makers, one thing that I'm encouraged by is there are some researchers, especially in health and transportation, who are really delving down and trying to get the experiential sense of how some groups that have been marginalized, for example, are really experiencing the policies that we've put in place. So a very technically challenging read, but really good piece written recently was just on by a Latino planning researcher named Jesus Barajas, who wrote about cycling willingness among Latino residents of a particular neighborhood in San Francisco. So really, really micro level, but on the other hand, he was able to show how even within that community, there's a lot of diversity. And depending on whether you were born in the US or not, depending on the peer group you associated with, your willingness to try a new approach to commuting could vary a lot. And some of that was experiential. A number of racialized minorities tend to feel less safe when they're walking or cycling because they have experienced more hostility because of racism. So I think there are many levels that we benefit from exploring in that empathic way.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Heather asks, sometimes it's not clear what you actually have influence over at work. So how do you figure this out?
I think it can be helpful to do some reflection on it. So for example, if there's an area that, for example, I was working with the healthcare team, and they were having lots of people go off on leave due to burnout, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, some of those occupational hazards, which of course we're at more risk for when serving the public and interacting with the public in various states of need, as you do as planners, is really central to the work. And they wanted to do something about wellness, and they came up with all kinds of things. Well, if they had more funding, they could hire more nurses and then deal with the workload. And there was a whole list of things that were ideas that they had. And so I had them look at the list and actually put a star by the things they could actually do something about. So their role didn't allow them to have any influence over funding in healthcare. But could they start a wellness committee and start generating, for example, some educational sessions at lunch about strategies for managing stress as a nurse, for example? And that was in their control. So to really sit down and brainstorm, what are some key areas what are things that are going on? What would you maybe like to do about it? So it's a broad question, and thank you for it, Heather. But to really think, what's the question under that question? Where is an area that you would like some influence and why? And then take a look at that and say, okay, you can even draw those 3 circles or 3 columns. What part of this issue do I have control over, influence, or no control?
Burnout in the workplace and so on. And the reason why I'm asking this question is I noticed the people who have registered for this webinar, we've had almost a full house, and about 90% of them are women. Now it's hard to tell because we do have a lot of group registrations, so I don't know what's happening with those. But for sure, with all the individual registrations, about 90% of those are women.
I'll take a first crack at that one. I think there's a couple of factors. I think one, communications and engagement tend to be disciplines that involve women, and I think also I'm on the board of Lean in Calgary, and these are all topics that come up in terms of burnout, in terms of all of the extra burden that I think women carry in terms of work, in terms of, especially when you're managing teams, you're forging those relationships, you're carrying the work burden, you're carrying the invisible work, they say, at home. So I do think women are particularly susceptible to that kind of burnout, especially, Lynda, when you put up that slide about, the point where your needs become secondary to absolutely everything. And I think that tends to be a place where we go. We tend to throw those things overboard first, or healthy eating or enough sleep or exercise or meditation often get sacrificed, and I think that is just something that women are particularly vulnerable to.
Thank you.
I would agree, but I would say one thing, I think we have to be careful. I absolutely agree. I mean, I think probably I could say that I've also faced sexism in the workplace and had to combat that. But I think it's good to also consider what strengths you have. Being conditioned to think more about empathy, actually in a public meeting setting can give you a lot of experience that sometimes, again, I'm going along gender stereotyping, and I don't mean to. There are many, many empathic men as well, but because women are conditioned more to think about other people, at times if we can draw on that skill set that we've been building and see it as a skill rather than us just facing a burden. So recognizing that, doing our work to combat the systemic issues, but also seeing the skills that it's brought us, I think can help us avoid that stress, the lower end of the stress continuum.
I think there's many, like others have said, complexities to it. And quite often with stress, we want that magic bullet? You know, what's that one thing I can do that will solve everything? And when we really get into the complexities of looking at stress management, you know, across genders, generations, occupational sectors, culturally, it's a big conversation, and there's no sort of one this or that. But I think if we think about, first of all, in part the answer I think has to do with gender socialization and what domains we put caring. You know, and caring is often an invisible labor and often an undervalued labor. And so when we start looking at the conversation of stress, historically it really was the individual's domain, whether you're a man, woman, and so forth. And I know we have wider definitions of gender today as well. That your job was to show up and do your job, and stress was your own problem. It wasn't considered the employer's domain to even talk about stress necessarily historically. And then we started to widen the conversation and started to look at, well, how, you know, if people are stressed at home, how does that impact what they bring to work? And more recently, we're widening the conversation again to say, yes, but what about how work stress impacts what happens at home? How is it impacting divorce rates? How is it impacting health? And the conversation just keeps getting bigger and bigger, in part because it's more and more prevalent. And the cost of stress is multi-billions of dollars across industries in our country. And then you can look at the stats through the World Health Organization, and they're compelling there as well. In other words, the problem is getting big enough that the attempt to have multiple interventions and solutions is also growing. And there's no easy answer because there's lots of beliefs about whose business it is to talk about stress. Is it the employers? Is it the individuals? And so we're in interesting times. If you think, for example, with WorkSafe BC, in terms of psychological stress
to all our
and
speakers.
the damage of stress,
Again,
that
an excellent presentation.
was a category
of
injury
about,
for an employer,
and,
you know, years
please
ago.
know we
now.
will be
So
sending out a recording of this webinar along with a PDF of the webinar slide deck, because I know a lot of people will want to review what you all said, as it was very interesting and useful for everyday living, really, not just work, but living. So thank you to our speakers. And very briefly, I wanted to touch on some of our future webinars coming up. April 29th, we have a legal update called Water and Land and Trees, Oh My. That sounds very familiar. And then on May 13th, we've just had this webinar confirmed today that it's a go. It was moved from an earlier date. A policy update from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. This is a very important one because I know there's some new policy directives coming up. They'll be talking about the development approval process, development approval review process, secondary suites, the housing needs report, and more. So if you're part of a municipality or local government, you won't want to miss this. Again, thank you everyone on behalf of PIBC for joining and participating in this webinar. Say bye now. Thank you all.